I've had the pleasure of knowing Jason Pamental for about a dozen years, and for pretty much that entire time, he has been one of the leading voices in developing responsive typography, and has done a great deal of good work in that area. He's an invited expert for the W3C working group on web fonts, and a great deal of what we take for granted today is stuff that he helped inspire or develop, and he's been educating people around the world about all of this. Today, yeah, today he is taking a look at, well, now that we're mostly there, in many cases, how do we take responsive typography and make it expressive to its topic? So I'm really curious to hear more about this. Thank you.
Okay, this good? All right. I tend to wander around too much to actually stay there and have this actually work, so hopefully this will work out a little bit better. So hello, thank you very much for having me back. This is, I think, the 6th or 7th ATypI event that I have presented at, and every time I come away being endlessly inspired by what I see everybody else talking about here. So just a huge thank you to everybody who has presented already, and to everybody who will be coming after this talk. Hopefully you'll find this one interesting as well. So a little bit more about me. I work for a company called ATypI. So if you're in the US and own a pet, then you've probably heard of us. If you are anywhere outside of the US, like everyone in this room, you might have no idea. But it's a pretty big company. There's about 11 billion US in revenue, so we sell a whole lot of dog treats and food. And on the design system team, which is where I work, part of what we do is try and communicate clearly, and as you can imagine, type does have a role in that. But the expressiveness of typography and e-commerce systems is maybe a little bit less. But as we have learned over the years, it's stories that actually convince people to buy things more so than just purely representing information, and that's where mixing editorial content and product content really starts to become very important, and how you do that on a screen. So before I advance to the next slide, I want to take a moment to acknowledge one of my forebears. And I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment, because one of the biggest inspirations in my life passed away in December. That was my father. He was a teacher. Great. And then the screen went to sleep. Okay, so I have to learn not to pause here. My father was a huge inspiration to me in wanting to get up and teach other people. And so this is the first time I've had a chance to give a talk since he passed, and I just want to acknowledge his contribution to inspiring me to hopefully get up here and inspire you. Moving ahead. The last time that I gave a talk was at Tech Talks in 2022, and this was where I had started to work through these ideas of multiple kinds of typography for different kinds of content. There's no crystal goblet. There is no one perfect form for that, because different kinds of information require different sorts of presentation. So editorial content meant for long form reading needs one style of typography. Things that are more information-centric, perhaps a checklist for an airplane safety kind of thing. Like, that's actually a different form of typography that you'd need. The thing is, they don't live in isolation either. There are times when you need all of them together. So even on an e-commerce site, you might have longer form product information that has one style of typography, but your pricing needs to be presented differently, and then related products might need a more compact presentation as well. So that really left me a little puzzled about how to bring these things together in one system. And because most of the time when you look at a design system, there is a typography ramp. There is one style of headers, one style of paragraph copy, and most systems don't really go beyond that. But as I mentioned, I work at a fairly large company. We have a design team that encompasses about 70 to 80 people in UX design and research, and we work with 900 engineers across 40 or 50 different applications that all comprise one website. So how do we make that scale? Well, this is for you, David. I wanted to make sure that we had a little bit more profanity on the screen today, so that was one of my later additions, so thank you. So how do we do that? Well, what I hit upon was a way that you could create related sets of typography in a single design system. And this also gets a little bit hard to follow when you look at one part of this ramp. On the top left are all the different weights and sizes for the product-focused typography, which has smaller scale differentiation and a lot closer line height. And then you look over on the other side, and this is the editorial style that has a little bit broader range. But it's all driven by the same underlying system of design tokens. And then it gives them a predictable way to name and reach through this different system so that I can teach 50 different designers how to start to apply this. And then you have to actually get down to designing with it. So what I created was a palette. And then this was one of the first places where we saw this in execution, where we have, we just opened our first veterinary clinic in Florida, and we have a bunch more that are going to be open. And we really needed typography that could tell the story of why you would want to come and get your pets treated here. But as you can see, as we scroll down the page, you still have that product style typography that's in use at the bottom. So we were able to take that, deploy it across a whole bunch of different areas of the application, and still maintain a consistent look and feel. And that was an important test for some of these ideas, and that was a first step. So this is great for something that is a single page that's designed to work once, but we need to be able to do this all the time, and we can't have great typography tied up in code deploys that can only go out every few months. We want to be a lot more flexible, which is where the idea of a content management system comes into play. Lots of you have heard of WordPress. Every company uses something like that, but not every system is really built with that kind of flexibility in mind. So this was a way to think through how might we create something to create those slides at the top of the homepage and have that actually be a little bit more interesting, and give the design team the ability to do this without ever having to deploy code. So what you're looking at is an actual working prototype. So if I go over here and I start clicking away at these things, we can move the text all around, and all of this stuff also scales and it's responsive. So if I want to see how might this look on a smaller screen, we can do that, except the JavaScript's not loading, so we won't. But all of these things can then be sort of tweaked, and they can build these slides with styles that are based in that ramp that I showed you previously, and they can also edit the content directly in the browser. So the creative services team and the site merchandising team can actually go in and typeset this banner. Now that was something that was really important to me to start to explore. How can we bring the role of design back into the web publishing process at the point where you have specific content, rather than trying to design something that works for all content? By the way, that's Leo. He's just about to turn 2. He's been my constant assistant in all of this, and you'll be seeing an awful lot more of him. So I'm not sure if it was originally Roger Black who said, "Design will save the world," right after rock and roll does, but I always imagine him saying that. So that's kind of the idea, is we need to set this up in a system that is sustainable and usable in a variety of situations. So how do we do that? Well, first off, everything that you're seeing here is done in a browser. So all of this is real web fonts real HTML, real CSS, things that can actually be put into production today. And I'm hoping that we can relate some great graphic design to some things that you could do on the web. And the extra twist on this is these are all actually built into a working WordPress site where I've created the interface so that you can upload the photo, add the text, and create some of these effects. So that is not a web page. That's a great poster by Yao, about a 1950s travel poster from Brazil. The links that you see under here are to a web typography newsletter that I was writing for a while, where all of these things are explained in a lot more detail with lots of code samples that you can play around with. But what's underneath that is Leo helping me out again. This is something that is generated live on the web and is also completely responsive. So you can upload the photo, you can add the text, you can add this block into your site. You could start to build some more interesting layouts with some of these different techniques. That's what the admin interface looks like. It's really simple. Just upload a photo, add the text, there you go. There's lots more flexibility you can build into this. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. So here's another one. This was from a beautiful cover from Typography Talks magazine from 1960. And underneath that, we've got Leo back again. And what you'll notice in the text overlaying the photo is there's a certain amount of transparency, but it's not just transparency. It's actually a CSS effect interpolating the color. So it's always going to have a little bit more contrast and react to the photo that's underneath it. You can see that a little bit better here. So again, it's a relatively straightforward thing where you add this block in your WordPress site, you add the photo, you add the text, and on the right, I've added some options so you can move the text around. So similar to that banner builder idea that I worked on at ATypI, this is a way for you to actually start to create a little bit more sophisticated layouts that can add up to a more interesting and compelling experience. Here's another one from Jennifer Morla. The thing that I wanted to point out is not just the reversal of contrast with the hand, but if you notice the type up at the top, that's another kind of interesting technique that has previously required an awful lot of work. Now with a line or two of CSS, we can create something that again is interpolating the color where the text overlays and actually creates a little bit more interesting tension. So we've got a combination of effects there where we have a shape that's masking the photo, and you can create a library of shapes if you want and pick one of those from a menu, and then add the text. And the overlay is also, again, something that scales pretty nicely. And so this one, again, I kept this one pretty straightforward. Add the text, add the photo, but you could add a shape library to that just as easily. And that could be something defined by CSS or even an SVG graphics to have something that's a little bit more, just a little bit more tailored or a more complex overlay. This is one of the last ones that I wanted to show, but this one kind of inspired me a little bit differently. I was looking at this collage and really loved the way that it was playing with the text reacting inside that shape. And so I wanted to see what could I do to get the text to react to the outside of a shape. And one of the things that was a really interesting development in CSS is that you can take an image with a transparent background, define that as the shape, and that becomes what the text wraps around. And that actually grows with the image itself. So again, this one was just upload a photo. It's a PNG format with a transparent background, and then the text will just move and scale around it. So you can see that even as the text size changes, the image changes, it still wraps really nicely around there. So it does give you the ability to create a much more interesting layout depending on the photo. Again, it didn't require any code to do that. It's just an image upload. So this is kind of what the rough thing looks like in WordPress right now. There's a little bit of alignment choices you can make. You upload the photo, and then it works and it responds really nicely. Now finally, this is one of the things that I started out with on this was a way to, I ride a bike. I buy lots of cycling clothing. I have a similar disease to Doug over here. We overspend greatly on this. This is why we do things related to type and design so we can get paid to buy more bike stuff. And so I decided to create a website where I would review some of the cycling kit that I wrote, and eventually everyone would want to read it, and all the companies would want to give me more cycling clothing. It has gone nowhere. Somebody mentioned side projects that you never actually get off the ground. Okay, so there's one. But it served as a sort of an idea breeding ground as I started to put these things together to figure out what else I could do. So the image wrapping was one thing. And actually, I want to come back. Notice what I put up here on the side. If anyone has heard me talk in the last 8 years, you've heard me talk about variable fonts. I'm a huge believer in them as part of the creative process in this way specifically, being able to incorporate that in how you put the text on screen related to a specific piece of content, again, rather than the universal. So we pick a typeface, we then expose some of the controls over here. So if you have a longer headline, you can make it a little narrower. If you want to achieve a different kind of editorial impact, maybe you crank it up a little bit more in the weight. All of that stuff's possible just by adjusting those sliders as you are working through the publishing process. And then you can get more interesting impact. Like I created the pull quote one down here again. It had a similar kind of thing where you could adjust the size and the scale and a few of the parameters of the variable font itself. And then together, it creates a much more interesting layout than you typically see with a blog without having to get into doing custom code for everything. So that brought a bunch of those ideas together, but it still falls short of really leveraging the true power of variable fonts in that web publishing process and that ability to art direct these things. So I actually started working on this idea a while back, actually, when we were working on the ATypI website. And then after a while, I started to think about some work that I'd done a long time ago on plugins for open source platforms to use web fonts. And actually, Venkat from Monotype is somebody that ended up working on some of that stuff. And he's now the CTO. You'll hear from him tomorrow. And he asked me to think about what might we do to incorporate variable fonts in a more meaningful way in an authoring experience. And so I started to mock that up so that we can actually start to put that into practice. So what you'll see next is not real yet, but I've been working on the UI for this and the idea for the plugin for WordPress. And really any other CMS, I would work kind of the same way. So with your typical rich text editor, you'd have a bold and italic button, but we could have, let's see if my little spotlight feature will work. There we go, that. If you clicked on that, then maybe you'd get a little bit more flexibility. So it might look something like that, or just depend on the typeface that you're using. If you've added a variable font to your theme, then you'd be able to, one would hope, have it automatically display all of the different axes that are available so that you could select a piece of text, modify it the way you need it to get the effect you're looking for, and have it work in line within that regular authoring process. So most of these things have been built individually. They haven't really been put together in one plugin. That's what I'm really hoping we'll be able to do and make that more widely available. And before we think that we're going to let this loose on absolutely everybody to be free to make terrible typography decisions, the idea would be to add a designer role in your CMS. So someone can write the content, somebody else can go make some design decisions. You might think that sounds a little bit like art direction in the publishing process. We could do that on the web. It's not familiar territory, but it is certainly possible. So having these ideas as a way to typeset specific text in a responsive way that will still work on any platform that you put it on, I think is really important for us to push design forward on the web in a way that AI will not necessarily be able to do for us. So that's I'm hoping a not too far in the future look at what we might be able to do in the web publishing process. We can already do some things. It's just a little bit clumsy. You saw what the earlier demos that I put together were things that were just leveraging what's available right now. This would build it in a little bit more tightly to the actual authoring process itself. And in really, I liked this quote enough to put it on my arm, but really what we're saying is that if type is the voice of our words, we should vary our voice. Thank you very much. If you want to snap a pic of that, all the slides are available embedded in a web page, so you can look at them. The formatting might be a little bit funky, but it's all there. And there's links to a bunch of other resources within the presentation itself if you want to read more of the typography tips.
Well, I think you should have brought Leo with you, but that's awesome. We do have time for some questions.
If you have questions, raise your hand.
They're stunned. Here.
During the rest of the event, if anybody's interested, I also do have that WordPress site running locally. So if you want to see how any of these things were put together, I'd be happy to walk through some of the demos with you as well, so you can see what the editing process looks like across all of it.
Right behind you.
I'm curious to see how you use that in an interactive way, because what you're showing us is you make some choices and then that's what it is. But I know you very well. That's not the only thing you think about.
True, but I think, well, all of it's designed to be responsive so that it will scale. And I think it's also something else I wanted to touch upon, is that I've had a lot of conversations with type designers and graphic designers over the years here at these conferences and elsewhere, when if it can't do absolutely everything that you can do in InDesign, they don't want to do anything at all. And I just think that's a real shame. John and I have worked on some stuff together about how to re-envision books on the web. And you do have to embrace a certain amount of serendipity in how things might reflow. But I think that's kind of what's beautiful about it. And when you start to see, so the interactive thing is, if you look at it on different devices, these layouts are going to be different. The type's going to scale differently. It'll wrap a little bit differently. And that's okay, because people come to the experience on the device that they're on. We're often the only weirdos that are like dragging the window in and out to see how things look. People come and they look at it on their phone. 75% of the people that come to Chewy look at it one way. It's on their phone. It's maybe in the browser, maybe in the app, but that's how they're looking at it. So individually, these views are fine. And as long as you're looking at what is delivering an appropriate experience, then the fact that it scales and changes a little bit is perfectly okay.
So this may be a little bit off what you were talking about, but I'm sure you have some knowledge to add to this. So a lot of what you were talking about was a lot of functionality, kind of pragmatic kind of application to broad audiences, make sure they can read it with some basic aesthetics implemented. So I'm wondering, kind of on the other extreme, the capabilities of web to kind of bring, I guess you could say, kind of artistic layered capabilities, fracturing type, kind of moving it around, kind of breaking type into new forms, but still in the in the web format, not kind of motion graphics kind of thing. Is there anything you can add on what's coming or what can be done? Would be great.
I'm glad that you asked about that, because somebody who's not here, but certainly is a big part of Tobias and Christine's life, Nina Stossinger, said something a few years ago that really struck me about how sometimes typography's job is not to speed up your reading experience, but rather to slow you down, to add friction to that process. And that's really why I made this change to the title slide an hour ago, was that I was really struck by this combination of a background image and then a masked image within the type and how they interplay together. And it went through a bunch of different iterations. I think David was looking over my shoulder and wondering what exactly I was getting at on there. But I think that that's really interesting. And so this combination of experimenting with some CSS techniques and experimenting with what fonts are capable of. I mean, I think this is where like the more axes, the better. I loved what David was showing about the idea of time. So the longer you look at something, the more it might change. I spent most of my years in worrying about web typography, really looking at only one case about how to make reading better, how to make it smoother, easier, more fluid, and really forgetting about that artistic side of it. And that's where I just feel like we need both. And it's okay if for some people it takes them a moment to read this, because the wonderful thing about this is it's still all regular text, so a screen reader gets it. So like we actually are able to help people experience this in the way that's appropriate to them. So again, like thinking about Pascal's talk earlier, it's critical that the user, or the reader, I'm sorry, user is a terrible term, the reader of this content be able to get it in a way that's meaningful and understandable to them. Whether it's to avoid a flight disaster or just to be able to read a book or to buy stuff for their pet, it's got to be accessible in a multiple of ways. And so real text is critical, but now we can be more expressive. And even when you look at the craziness of Decovar, one of the first experimental variable fonts that very easily can create things that look nothing like real letter forms. I mean, it actually, it made what Mary was playing around with look normal, in some of the ways that it would generate these different forms, but it's actually still real text underlying it. So anybody with a screen reader, anybody using any other kind of assistive technology still gets what they need out of it. But if it's easier for somebody else to read it when it looks like growing grass, then fine, they can do that. So I love the idea of putting the control for some of these things in the hands of the user. We actually, I designed the web platform for the state in which I live, and we built a bunch of control into the user interface so that they can set the word spacing, the line spacing, and the font size personal to them. So if it's easier for them to take things in, if you've got dyslexia and suffer from crowding, you could increase your reading comprehension by 50% if you space things out more. And I think that's really powerful. So again, it sort of like works on both ends of that spectrum, and they don't have to be at odds. I could go on about that, but I'll stop.
David, we have one last question right in the corner there, back in the, if you can. And then we're going to
Thanks, Jason.
close today.
I feel like you outlined a few different levels of expertise that people who are creating content for the web might have. So you have like somebody who's not a designer who needs a way of filling information into the CMS. You have somebody who, so maybe that's the person without art director permissions. And then you have somebody with art director permissions, or maybe it's a junior designer, maybe they're using your tool that was creating that banner and choosing the different options. But then I'm wondering, like you also showed that Brazilian travel poster, which is so beautiful and like capable of being reproduced on the web today. That does not exist in a design system. And it's important that a design system doesn't constrain the creative process when you're trying to create something like that. You don't want a whole website necessarily to look like that, right. But how do you advocate in a company with like many designers and also as an appreciator of those very creative forms of design on the web, like how do you carve out those spaces that can be more like a creative sandbox or something, or like how do those fit into an otherwise design system-y ecosystem or landscape?
That's a great question, and something I think everybody who works on the web struggles with this on some level. The larger the project, the more important it is you have some kind of unifying design system. And at ATypI, we've done a lot of work to try and figure out what is that getting us. And what it gets us on the development side is that by some estimates, it's 50% or more reduction in the amount of time it takes to produce an interface. And so there's a tremendous time savings there. So the necessary thing is to have a good design system. But as I said, actually, in that previous talk I was mentioning, design systems should be a plateau, not a pinnacle. And so the savings that we get, we've got to get there. We need to have the design system, and it has to have that escape valve. And so that huge matrix of typography that I showed you is the palette. So now that we have it, and it's all set up in this series of tokens that are scalable and themable for different products and all different kinds of applications, we can use that more freely. And then to go that extra step, then there should be time to play. I love the idea of introducing posters back to the web. And actually, this started out as playing around earlier today to create what I wanted to think of as a social media poster. Oh, there we go again. And so I started out just making something square, but that was, using some of these techniques and kind of playing around with that. So the idea of everything is sort of built mostly with these components, but you should have areas where you can veer away or expand upon that. But usually it's done building on some of those underlying styles. So that's kind of where we are right now, and I'm pushing to try and incorporate more of this in our CMS and in the way the designers work. It's a little bit to be determined. I think design systems are great up to a point, and unless you allow for that growth and that expansion, then yes, it does have the potential to really kill the creativity, but it doesn't have to.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, everybody.
Grab your mic up here because I got yelled at the other day for using both at the same time. Jason is around. He's actually going to be one of your moderators tomorrow. If you have any questions, please take some time and talk with Jason. That's one of the greatest things about ATypI is you actually get to talk to all your speakers. We're here, we're accessible. At this time, we're closing out day 2. Thank you very much for staying with me. Don't forget, we start tomorrow at 9:15. Don't drink too much tonight, okay? I'd like to see you tomorrow morning. Thank you again. Bye-bye.